Welcome to the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thanks for being with us today. With spring break here and the peak summer travel season approaching, a whopping 90% or more of Americans say they plan to travel for vacation this year. But travel planning is being complicated by uncertainty due to several factors, including current global instability due in large part to the U.S. and Israeli war in the Middle East. That conflict has led to a spike in oil prices, driving up the costs of flights and gas. The ongoing partial government shutdown has also led to longer wait times for security lines as the Transportation Security Administration deals with staffing shortages, with TSA workers currently being asked to work without pay. To help us understand this moment in the travel market, we have a local and a national travel expert with us today, and we want to ask them your questions. So now's the time, get those questions into us. You can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org or message us on Instagram. We're at The Sound of Ideas. Maybe you have some upcoming travel planned and you're curious if anything will be disruptive, or maybe you're wondering what the best options are for you right now and when the best time is for travel. Anything like that, any comments or questions, please do call in or email in and let us know. Now, with me in studio, we have Phil Rodolfi. He's the owner of The Exceptional Traveler. This is a travel agency here in Northeast Ohio that operates small group tours in Europe and the United States. Phil, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's great to be here.
By phone, joining us, we have Zach Wichter. He's a consumer travel reporter for USA Today and writes the Cruising Altitude column. Zach, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
And Zach, I'll start with you. I'm going to ask both of you this question to kick us off the show here. I wanted to start with the war in the Middle East and how that's impacting travel. What are you hearing on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so the biggest impacts we've seen recently were immediately after the war started, a lot of the major connecting hubs in the Middle East shut down. And so that really affected US travelers who were either going to that part of the world or flying through, a hub like Dubai in order to get somewhere in Asia or Africa, which is a really common itinerary for US travelers to take. Since that Arab space has started reopening, the disruptions have slowed down in that sort of acute initial phase. But now we're seeing what you mentioned in the opener about oil prices, and that's going to be a longer term thing to watch. And also, as this war evolves, if there are more issues in the airspace over the Middle East, we could see further disruption like what we saw at the beginning of the war. So oil prices and connecting traffic are the two major trends that I'm watching.
And Phil, how about for you? Anything you're seeing?
Well, for example, I had a couple who had a trip planned to Turkey and Azerbaijan. They canceled it a couple weeks ago when the war broke out. And it's really hard to predict what will happen as Iran seems to be shooting almost haphazardly at their neighbors. The Dubai airport got hit again yesterday. So my advice to travelers right now is to really avoid the whole Middle East, including neighboring countries like Turkey.
Is safety something your clients are concerned about that you've seen, Phil?
Really concerned. And they're also concerned with some of the collateral impact. As Zach said, if you've got a flight originating in Dubai or transiting through Dubai, but flying to Paris, and then you're picking it up there to come back to the States, that flight could be impacted. So you really have to pay attention to where your plane is coming from.
So, Zach, do you think that kind of covers the impact of travel that we're seeing in the Middle East right now? Anything else you want to add about other travel areas that are being impacted? I know Phil had just mentioned there are places that are impacted by originating flights coming from these other areas.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think we covered all the key bases. I mean, obviously, with a war, the situation is constantly evolving, so we'll see if anything changes. But I expect that the sort of acute phase of disruptions may be behind us as airlines kind of get to plan around airspace closures that may be in place for a while.
Speaking of other conflict in the area, Phil, the Middle East is not the only area where that's happening right now. Recently, travelers were stranded in Mexico. So, what are you telling people that you're talking with about Mexico travel plans?
Well, the latest word we got in Mexico is that most of the country is in good shape. Mexico City in particular. That's pretty safe. But in the northwest part of the country, the Jalisco province or state. That's where Guadalajara is. That's where Puerto Vallarta is. That's still a little unsettled. So my advice to travelers is to stay away from there. Go to Mexico City. Go to some of the ports on the eastern side of the country, on the Caribbean side.
Zach, let's talk about how airlines and airports are adapting to this. We do see them be pretty adaptable in situations like this. So, do you think travelers can feel comfortable knowing that as time passes, they'll be able to route around trouble spots?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a really good example of this, if we pull back out a little farther, is the Russia Ukraine conflict. So, a lot of flights from the US to Asia traditionally used Russian airspace. And when that conflict started, Russian airspace got closed down to all the US airlines and most major Western airlines generally. And so, initially, that meant that airlines may have had to cancel flights just because they hadn't planned for this airspace closure. But in the years since that conflict started, airlines have been able to reroute their flights. They're able to take slightly longer routes from the US to Asia. And that may mean, that you're going to be on a flight that's both longer in distance and duration, which may mean slightly higher ticket prices, but your flight isn't going to get canceled if it had been on a route that would have used Russian airspace. And so I suspect that we're going to see the same thing in the Middle East with this conflict. If these airspace closures are in place for a long time, yes, we saw this early disruption where a lot of airlines had to cancel flights because airports were closed. Now that the airports are reopened, but there are still airspace restrictions, they're just going to have to fly different corridors. And so airlines are really good at adapting to these changes. And I expect that we'll see less disruption as those adaptations are implemented.
Okay. We have an email now from Audrey. Audrey in Cleveland Heights writes in, I'm planning a trip to Prague and Vienna for September. It feels like it's too early to buy the flights because flight times often change. How early is too early to purchase flights? Phil, I'll ask you.
I think it's a great time to purchase the flights now. We're starting to see airfare prices creep up because of the price of oil going up. That impacts jet fuel. So I think it makes sense to buy those tickets now and lock in what probably is the lowest price you're going to see on airfare, at least for a few months.
Now, Audrey mentioned there some of her concerns were flight times changing. What kind of fluctuation might you expect if you do buy a ticket to Prague or Vienna now that would happen in September or October?
That does happen a lot, but usually the changes are pretty minor, maybe 15 minutes, maybe a half hour, but sometimes it can range up to a couple of hours. If that happens, the airlines are pretty accommodating about making changes if that puts you into a time slot that you just can't travel in.
Okay. If you're just joining us here on The Sound of Ideas, we are talking about travel concerns when it comes to spring and summer travel. We're talking about the international political situation, as well as the partial government shutdown here at home and the impact that's having on travel. If you have a question or a comment, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. We have two travel experts with us, a local expert and also a national expert. Zach, let's talk about what travelers can do to do their best to keep up with where maybe there are warnings for travel or maybe travel is impacted. There's something called the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program. Tell us about that and how that works.
Yes, so that is a program through the State Department where essentially you notify the State Department of your travel plans. So if you're going abroad, you can enroll in this program on the State Department's website, and that will both alert the State Department that you're there. So if something happens and you need to get out, you'll have easier access to resources because they'll already know that you're on the ground. But also it allows you to receive updates from the State Department. And so once they have your contact information, they'll send you any applicable advisories related to your trip. If you're not going to do that, or even if you do that, another thing that you can do is just check the State Department's website. They're really good about posting information about any potential issues in all of the different countries. I was actually working on an article about travel to Mexico yesterday, and check the State Department's advisory for Mexico. They have a page like that for all of the countries, both where we have embassies and ones that we don't have embassies in.
How long does it take to get enrolled in that program, the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program? Zach, do you have any idea to get that up and running?
I'm not sure off the top of my head, but from the reporting I've done, it seems pretty instantaneous. It's just like, you fill out a form online and then you're enrolled for your trip.
Okay. And can you tell us anything about how many countries are currently under advisory for American travelers?
So there is an advisory for pretty much every country, which is to say the State Department gives you a classification for what to expect on the ground. Like they say that it's all advisories, but they basically range from, it's like a low level risk, totally safe to travel, to do not travel. And I don't know off the top of my head how many countries fall in each category. So your best bet if you're traveling somewhere and you have questions is to check the page for the destinations that you're heading to.
Okay, I did just get a note from my producer here. Apparently, 21 countries are listed as do not travel, which is level 4, and 23 to 30 countries are reconsidered travel, which is level 3 at this time, unless there have been any adjustments in the last few moments, which is always a
You never
possibility.
know. Yeah, exactly.
You never know. Now, Phil, I'll ask you, you're planning group travel for people, small groups, albeit, but there are wide-ranging levels of comfort when it comes to risk, when it comes to travel. So how does that factor into planning group activities?
When I'm planning a group travel session, whether it's to Italy or we're doing a tour of London, Normandy, and Paris in September, we're booking that pretty far in advance. And I always recommend that the people on our tours take out trip insurance. And I like to recommend Fay Insurance, which has been a company that's great to work with. They're internet-based, but they've got great ratings. And that you can purchase different types of trip insurance. Right now, my recommendation would be to purchase cancel for any reason insurance, or CFAR, because that will pay us at least a 75 to 80% benefit in the event you just decide you're not comfortable traveling. Standard trip insurance doesn't have that ability. But if you're going to buy CFAR insurance, you need to do it within the first 2 weeks of having made your first payment for that trip.
CFAR is a very apt name for that. You cannot see far into the future, so you might want to get that trip insurance. I'll tell you what, I've never been a fan of trip insurance, but you're saying that's probably a really good bet if you're going to be planning this long-term distant travel.
Yeah, you never know what's going to happen between now and the time you travel. And a lot of our tours are planned a year or so in advance. So anything could happen between now and then. We've seen it with COVID. We're seeing now with these various wars that have broken out. So I think it makes sense. I was kind of in your boat as well. I really didn't pay much attention to trip insurance until the last 6 years.
I guess I'm just optimistic that I hope my travel plans will always pan out. But, it's been a while since, we did just have our honeymoon in Italy. But before that, we're usually planning trips maybe 2 months out, not really kind of like a year out kind of thing. So that is good to know. If you're just joining us here on The Sound of Ideas, we are talking about spring and summer travel concerns. We'd like to hear from you if you have any questions for our two experts here that can tell us all about the things that we need to be aware of when it comes to planning that travel. The number is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. We have a call now from Charles in Cleveland. Charles, welcome to The Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
Hi, I had a question about our national parks and this administration's effect on travel, local travel, and how those cutbacks in the national parks would affect travelers trying to go there throughout the year.
Thank you for the question, Charles. Zach, I'll ask you. Charles is asking there if there's anything people should be aware of in terms of cuts that were made by this administration when it comes to traveling to the national parks around the country.
Yeah, definitely. So I actually was just in Yellowstone about a month ago and had a chance to see firsthand what the changes to the National Park Service have done. And my understanding essentially is it isn't having a huge impact at most parks on, opening dates and times. Like parks are public lands, and so they're generally pretty open. The bigger problem is because of the staffing cuts and also because of these funding cuts that have happened to the National Park Service, they're not as able to maintain the infrastructure in the parks. And so the real complication for travelers is going to be, accessibility of features within the parks, just because if they're not able to do the same kind of upkeep, once you're in the park, it can be a little harder to navigate.
Thank you for the answer there, Zach. And we have an email now from Kate. Kate writes in, what about cruise ships? How are they adapting to the war? Phil, I'll ask you, do you have any information on that?
Yes, cruise ships actually have the unique ability to avoid places where there are problems. For example, I had some folks who were on a cruise last week and 2 weeks ago, two different couples, that was in the Mexico area. 2 weeks ago, they just avoided the Mexican ports. They didn't even stop there, just went on to the next port. Last week, they missed one of the stops because of weather, but they still docked at Cozumel, and it was business as usual. So they are pretty safe when it comes to this because they just have a great ability to avoid the big problems.
We were talking a bit earlier about timing for planning trips. We asked Phil about that in response to Audrey in Cleveland Heights' question. So, Zach, I'll ask you now. We've seen gas prices jumping here in Northeast Ohio and the other states since the conflict in Iran started. So, in general, is that translating into higher costs for flight tickets?
We haven't seen that happen yet, but it seems almost inevitable if this spike is going to be a long-term trend and not just a little blip. Fuel is one of the largest costs for airlines, and so if their main input for cost goes way up, then they're going to inevitably pass that cost on to consumers. And that's why I agree with what Phil was saying earlier. If you're planning any travel in the coming months, not just for summer, but even beyond, now's the time to book because it seems very likely that ticket prices are going to be going up and are going to be trending upward, especially if the conflict in the Middle East drags on.
We've got a call now from Bob in Cleveland. Bob, welcome to the Sound of Ideas. What's your question?
Yeah, he didn't make any mention of South America, specifically the Venezuela area, and now we're going to be threatening Cuba. So the Caribbean could be possibly in dangerous area. And the other question is, when I returned from Europe on a trip, I noticed that there was one customs agent for foreigners and one customs agent for Americans returning. But the line for Americans was tremendously long and tedious, while the foreign customs agent had nothing to do. Why does the customs office treat Americans poorly?
Thank you for the question, Bob. Phil, do you have anything to say in regard to that?
I think it's just a numbers situation. There are a lot more Americans coming back to this country than foreigners coming in. And they're struggling because of some of their staffing cutbacks to deal with the volume of travel that they're handling at this point. Plus, we've suspended our global entry program, which means that everybody, virtually everybody, needs to go through the regular customs process. So that's added significant amount of time for those folks who are coming back into the USA.
Phil, if I can jump in here for a sec, it actually just broke right before we came on the air that global entry reopened this morning at 5 a.m. Eastern. So they walked that back as of very early this morning.
That's great news. I was surprised that they did that, and I didn't really understand it. That'll make things go a lot smoother.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you for getting in with that breaking news update, Zach. I had just seen that this morning, and so very curious about that for sure. People pay a lot of money to be a part of the global entry program, and then if you're traveling and not able to use it, that can be upsetting for people. Now, let's talk about some of the issues there. So it was the partial government shutdown that was related to the global entry and TSA pre-check suspension. there. So we do know that TSA agents are in a third week without pay. We know that more TSA agents are calling out of work, if you can call it that. I don't know if you can call it calling out of work if you're not actually being paid to be there. But Phil, I'll ask you, do you have recommendations for travelers dealing with security lines in Cleveland or Akron, and how early should they get to the airport?
Well, I think we should start following those guidelines of 2 hours for domestic flights, 3 hours for international. But it's going to be dependent on each specific airport. We're kind of lucky in Cleveland. Our wait times are never all that long, but it would be best going forward to check with the airport's website to determine what the TSA wait times are. And you can do that the morning of your flight. That's probably when you should do it. There were some big problems over the weekend in Houston and New Orleans, and they're still having some problems in those airports. It's going to be sporadic. It's going to affect different airports. So you really need to check on a case-by-case basis.
You know, I think the tricky thing about this too is the information available on websites. I know sometimes those aren't exactly kept up to date when you do have TSA agents who are not working because of the partial government shutdown. So that can be very tricky. I think we need in-person scouts at the airports is what we need. People monitoring those lines for us, which, you know, local news usually actually does do a pretty good job of when there is some sort of travel situation going on. Now, Zach, I want to ask you about larger airports like Chicago or Atlanta. We do know that Houston and New Orleans had some really tricky security line situations over the weekend, as Phil was kind of mentioning there. For those airports, or if you've got flights that are coming through those airports, what do you recommend for people in terms of getting there and considering your flight situation?
Yeah, so if you're going to one of those big airports that you've been seeing on the news with long lines, definitely leave yourself even more time. And similar advice to what we were just talking about with your local airport, check on the airport's website, see what they're saying about wait times. The TSA does not seem to be updating its apps in terms of wait times, and so you're going to be better off going directly to the airport website or app. So definitely leave yourself extra time. I would maybe even go for some of the larger airports beyond the 2 hours for domestic and 3 hours for international, because the worst thing that could happen if you get there too early is you have a little bit of extra time to kill at the airport. But if you're stuck in a remarkably long security line, you don't want to stress out missing your flight. Now, the good news is if you're just transiting through one of these hubs, especially if you have a domestic-only itinerary, you won't have to worry about security lines on your connection, and so it's much less likely to have an impact. But if you do have an international flight that you're connecting through, you will have to re-clear security after going through customs. But typically, airports have separate security lines for people who have gone through that process, and those lines do tend to be shorter.
For anyone just joining us here on The Sound of Ideas, we're talking about spring and summer travel, both domestically and internationally. We have two travel experts with us, so we are ready for your calls with your questions and your comments. If you have planned travel, or if you're thinking about planning travel, or maybe you want to share a travel story with us, those can be very interesting to hear sometimes. Our number is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. If anybody listening or watching the show today has a travel trip insurance story, I would love to hear that. I am fascinated by the concept of travel insurance, which is something that we talked about a bit earlier today. Let's talk about infectious diseases and something that people kind of need to be aware of. So, Phil, we had talked about some of the advisories and warnings from the State Department, but the Centers for Disease Control has issued travel advisories for 30 destinations, including Europe, and this is due to polio. So, what should travelers think about vaccination-wise when it comes to traveling?
Well, I think the safest thing to do is get vaccinated. And most of us are. I think if you are vaccinated for polio, you're going to be just fine. If you're not, then you should either consider being vaccinated or perhaps you need to avoid those countries.
Zach, anything that you're hearing or seeing reported about when it comes to vaccination concerns for travel domestically or internationally? You know, we have had some measles outbreaks here in the U.S.
Yeah, I agree with Phil. I think the best thing that you can do to protect yourself is to get vaccinated. And if you don't want to get vaccinated or are ineligible to get vaccinated for some reason, you should avoid areas where there are outbreaks. Similarly, the State Department also has information on required and recommended vaccines, particularly if you're traveling to the developing world. So it's a good idea to check those guidelines. Now, I can't remember if it's the State Department or the CDC, but one of the major government agencies has advisories on what vaccines they recommend getting based on your travel itinerary. And so it's worth checking that out and making sure that your travel vaccines are also up to date if they're recommended.
And what about just traveling in an airport in a state that's having a measles outbreak, like Texas, for example, Zach? Should people be wearing a mask on the plane, in the airport? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're already vaccinated, you're probably going to be pretty safe, but it never hurts to bring that extra layer of protection with you. So if you're traveling somewhere that there's a known disease cluster, wearing a mask or doing your social distancing as best you can is probably a good idea.
We've got an email now in from Susan. Susan writes, I am traveling to Tanzania this fall. I hope. My question has to do with two flight itineraries. Flights are much cheaper from New York City to Nairobi, and then getting a smaller flight to the final destination. What's the risk, if any, on the two itineraries? Phil, I'll ask you.
I like to connect in New York and then take a flight from New York to wherever I'm going, whether it's Africa, Europe, etc. There are so many more choices out of New York, and it just makes your life a lot easier. However, if you're doing that, you probably should consider flying to New York either early in the day or the day before and staying over, have fun in New York, have a nice dinner, see a
Sure.
Broadway show. That way, you're not stressing out about making your connection. But the choices of flights from New York all over the world are so vast that it just, and you can get the best deal that way.
Man, who doesn't want to spend a night in New York? I mean, I guess there are people who don't, but I personally am a big fan, lived there for a few years. Okay, let's talk about people traveling domestically. Zach, do you expect travelers to stay in the U.S. this summer, or do you think that international travel will be as it normally is?
So I think there may be some slight decline in international travel for this summer because of the conflicts and rising prices and all of that. But I also think that a lot of people have probably already booked or are just about to book their summer travel. So I'm not sure that there's going to be a huge impact necessarily. We're sort of in the golden booking window for international travel, and those trips are typically planned with slightly longer lead time. So I expect a lot of people who are planning to travel abroad this summer may have already locked that in. But I do think for the last minute planners and the people who are still kind of up in the air about what they're going to do, just because of the conflicts abroad and the rising prices, it seems likely that people may start to favor domestic travel for this summer.
Up in the air is the perfect phrase to use when we're talking about uncertainty with travel. Up in the air or
Yeah.
grounded, either way, right?
Right.
If you're just joining us here on The Sound of Ideas, we have a few more minutes with our travel experts. And if you have a call, if you want to call or email in with a comment or a question, now's the time to do it. The number is 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. We talked a bit about cruises earlier, Phil, and their ability to kind of get around if there's a trouble spot on their route. Do you think that cruises are a good alternative for people concerned with international travel right now?
I think they are. I think the other alternatives are, like you just asked about travel in the United States. If you're really concerned about what's happening overseas, stay home. We've got plenty of places to stay in the US to see in the USA. If you're not as concerned about being in Europe, by all means go to Europe. It seems very safe at this point. You never know how things can escalate, but as long as this war stays contained in the Middle East, I think Europe's going to be fine. If you're worried about being in a big city and all of the things that come with that, now's a great time to explore the smaller cities and the smaller regions, which will also be less crowded and maybe more fun, just depending on your travel style.
We do know that the airport in Brussels is closed, and that's due to strikes. So something a bit of a different issue there. We've got an email now in from Timothy Timothy says, my family is traveling to Paris in a few weeks from Charlotte. Any issues with the airport in Paris? Zach, have you heard anything about that?
I mean, nothing more than the issues that are always in Paris, which is that Charles de Gaulle is extremely annoying to navigate. So certainly on the way out, leave yourself some extra time and, expect that you may have some long customs lines there. But as far as I know, things are um, pretty standard operating procedure in Paris at the moment. We do often see strikes at European airports over the summer. And so that's something, again, to prepare for some disruptions, but I'm not expecting there to be any like major closures or anything like that.
There was a railway strike when we were in Italy for our honeymoon in September. So, it does happen, and we had to kind of, adjust a little bit there. So, Zach, my last question for you, thank you for being with us today, is are Americans being welcomed in international travel right now? Should Americans traveling internationally be concerned about that at all, how they'll be received?
I think that that's really going to be your mileage may vary, but depending on how you comport yourself, you want to be respectful when you go to destinations. But I, for example, just got back from Canada, and there have obviously been some cross-border tensions, but people in Canada were very happy to see us coming and to accept our American dollars. So I think so long as you're a respectful traveler anywhere, that's really going to be the best way for you to kind of unlock the warmness of your destination. I will say one of my colleagues recently wrote a story about Americans saying that they're from somewhere else, or, if they're from America, they might say what state they're from instead or something like that. And so I think Americans are feeling a little cautious. But again, if you are, fun to be around, people are going to want to be around you.
Phil, are you seeing that people are gravitating toward group tours so that they have some camaraderie with them when they're traveling internationally?
I think that's one facet of it that people like. The other is that I do all the planning. They just have to show up and participate. I would echo what Zach just said about how we comport ourselves. And that extends also to how we behave when we're in the airports as we're traveling. A lot of people have really short fuses these days. And I don't think a day goes by without hearing about some airport or airplane incident, domestically and internationally. I think we just need to step back, chill out a little bit, and when we're traveling overseas, enjoy that country's culture. Try to be a little bit of a part of it. You're never going to fit in. They're always going to know that we're Americans. We can't hide that. But if you're open to doing as the locals do, I think you can have a much richer experience.
Very good to know, and we do appreciate the advice coming in from our experts today. And so I'll thank our guests now for being with us. Phil Rodolfi, owner of The Exceptional Traveler. Thanks for being with us in studio.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And Zach Wichter, a consumer travel reporter for USA Today. Zach, thank you for calling in today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, we'll take a quick break now. When we come back, we'll hear a conversation from the Brains on Tap series, looking at how Alzheimer's might show up in certain animals and how research on that can help humans. This is The Sound of Ideas. I'm Stephanie Haney. We'll be right back. This is The Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for staying with us today. Alzheimer's disease is now the 6th leading cause of death in the U.S., currently affecting around 7 million Americans living with this disease. That's according to the Alzheimer's Association. It's a very real consequence of humans' long lives compared to other animals. But some other animals, like dogs, cats, pigs, and chimpanzees, can get Alzheimer's. So researchers are studying how it affects them. Today, we'll hear a discussion about how Alzheimer's affects chimpanzees specifically, and how studying that can help medical professionals treat humans. Plus, we'll learn about lifestyle changes that can help reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. This conversation is part of the Brains on Tap series. This is a pre-recorded conversation. It was in November at Sibling Revelry Brewing in Westlake. So we cannot take your calls right now, but we do always welcome your thoughts via email. You can email us at soi@ideastream.org or send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Here now is IdeaStream's Jeff St. Clair.
Welcome to Brains on Tap, where we combine neuroscience and craft beer. IdeaStream is proud to partner with Kent State University Brain Health Research Institute and NeoMed, and thanks to the fine people at Sibling Revelry here in Westlake. Alzheimer's disease affects around 50 million people worldwide, and despite decades of research and billions of dollars in research, it's one of science's most intractable mysteries. We still don't know what causes the disease or how to treat it. Tonight, we're stepping outside the mainstream with two local researchers who are coming at Alzheimer's from unique angles. In her lab at Kent State University, Melissa Edler studies how Alzheimer's affects other animals, especially our cousins, the chimpanzee. In her lab, she says many animals, even dogs and cats, get Alzheimer's, but they rarely have the severe symptoms that we have in humans. Her work looks at how the chimpanzee brain actually resists severe Alzheimer's, and how that might help learn how to treat it in humans. Meanwhile, Takhar Kasumov at Northeast Ohio Medical University studies the links between Alzheimer's and diabetes and the risks that alcohol poses to brain health. Cheers, yeah. Takhar is shedding light on how Alzheimer's can be viewed as a metabolic disorder, and that some of his research shows reducing inflammation and improving brain health helps reduce risks. He's also looking at ways to minimize the risk of Alzheimer's disease. We're going to learn more about that. Brains on Tap here on WKSU.
So, what have we learned so far from chimpanzees? So our team was one of the first to discover that chimpanzees have the main pathologic hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. And that includes both diffuse and dense core plaques, as well as vascular amyloid, which is a condition that we actually see in about 80 to 90% of Alzheimer's disease, where we have a buildup of that amyloid beta protein in the blood vessels in the brain. We see that conserved across a ton of different species. We see that in cats, we see that in dogs, bears, wolverines, dolphins, pretty much all of the primates. What we do not see as frequently, though, are the dense core plaques. Primarily, dense core plaques are found in humans with Alzheimer's and chimpanzees to date. So chimpanzees are one of the few species that actually have the dense core plaques. Chimpanzees are also one of the few species that have tau lesions, such as neurofibrillary tangles in the brain. And neurofibrillary tangles are key in models for Alzheimer's disease because those, rather than amyloid beta plaques, are what are most associated with cognitive decline in Alzheimer's and cell loss. But what's really cool in chimpanzees is we see that amyloid beta plaques and vascular amyloid increase with age just like human brains. So after we looked at amyloid beta and tau lesions, we wondered then, are these causing any sort of cell loss? So we measured neuron densities. So we basically quantified the number of neurons in various brain regions. And interestingly enough, we found that they're not. They're not experiencing age-related loss, which we see in humans that's very mild and in a few brain regions. They're also not experiencing it with amyloid beta or tau pathology. This is very different from humans with Alzheimer's disease. And it suggests that despite having the pathologies that we see present in the brain, they are not experiencing the cell loss. They appear protected. So what are some of the other questions that we're trying to answer? Big questions that we're investigating right now are whether levels of these amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles and vascular amyloid are similar in humans and chimps. Nobody's done a direct study. So we are now analyzing over 100 chimpanzee brains, 5 to 6 brain regions per brain, as well as 115 human brains that are across the lifespan of both species and with pathology and without Alzheimer's pathology. Our hypotheses, working hypotheses currently, is that chimpanzees will have lower levels of amyloid beta plaques, higher levels of vascular amyloid, and significantly lower levels of neurofibrillary tangles, which is why we suspect that they are protected and not losing neurons. In addition, one of the other big components of Alzheimer's is it's not just these pathologies in the brain or in the blood that we're measuring, it's the cognitive symptoms. So we are trying to determine whether these lesions in the brain, in post-mortem brain, are correlating with cognitive decline. And we have Collaborators out at MD Anderson who have been collecting antemortem cognitive data, both for physical cognition and social cognition, for the past 30 years. They have this data in animals that have since passed away and that we now are able to start quantifying these lesions associated with Alzheimer's disease. So this is one of the biggest questions out there to really determine, does any other species outside of humans actually have and suffer from Alzheimer's? I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Dr. Kasimov, who's going to talk to you about type 2 diabetes.
Now, a recent study published in The Lancet actually identified that about 45% of Alzheimer's disease cases are preventable. Specifically, in the middle age period, we have multiple factors contributing to Alzheimer's disease. Not only diabetes and alcohol abuse, there are other factors that also related to this two. For example, during alcohol abuse, many people also smoke. So smoking also can contribute. Diabetes related to obesity. Diabetes also has complication, hypertension. Diabetes also can cause cardiovascular disease. So basically, if we can control diabetes, then we can control some of this. So people with type 2 diabetes have 50% higher risk of all-cause dementia and also Alzheimer's disease, about 30-60% higher in diabetic patients. So in a collaboration with my colleague at the Cleveland Clinic, we initiated recently a study whether exercise can slow down or prevent Alzheimer's disease development. We all know that brain exercise is good, but we just said regular exercise. This was very exciting finding for us. Now we try to understand what is the mechanism, how exercise can prevent not only brain demyelination, but also cognition and tau accumulation. So what we can do in case of diabetes, well, just try to keep your A1C under the control. Move most of the days, eat Mediterranean style, don't smoke. If you drink, avoid heavy use, get help early for alcohol use disorders. And stay socially and mentally active, protect sleep and hearing, which are also very important. And thank you for your attention. I would like to thank our founders, sponsors, NIH, Brain Health Research Institute, NeoMed, and Kent State in case of Dr. Edler. And please, if you have any questions.
Dr. Melissa Edler and Dr. Takar Kasimov. I think we should all feel good knowing that our brains are working, so that's going to offset the alcohol use here. It's sibling revelry, and we're all being social, so this is good. One of the things that really jumped out at me of your presentation was if we share 99% of our genes with the chimpanzee, whatever that number is, how do you attribute the difference in disease progression? What is the difference in the human brain compared to the chimpanzee brain?
So that's what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah.
So one thing that we do know is energy metabolism is a big factor and a big difference between apes and humans as well. As Dr. Kasimov mentioned,
They're stronger and faster.
They are stronger and faster, but they use less energy. Their brains use less energy than the human brain. So our brains are very large for our body size. We have a lot of cortical folds, and we have very complex synaptic processes and things like that that are spread throughout. And we have neurons that extend from our brain all the way down to our toes, like processes from those cells. So these are the cells that tend to be most affected and targeted are the long myelinated or unmyelinated too. Cells that are spreading through the body, they're easier to target. So the ones that are staying up in the brain and local, those ones are harder to actually, they tend to not die as easily. So one of the things that we're looking at next is going to be myelination and whether there are differences between species in myelination. We are also looking at things like neurotransmitters. So we know that in Alzheimer's disease, neurotransmitters such as acetylcholine, in Parkinson's disease, dopamine, these are actually affected in humans. But there are huge species differences both in between rodents and humans in neurotransmitters, but also between chimps and humans. For instance, we know that acetylcholine is actually higher in apes, particularly chimpanzees, and they found that it has an anti-inflammatory response, higher levels of acetylcholine in the brain. So that is a working hypothesis too, that it could be neurotransmitter differences that are contributing to some of these deleterious effects that we see in humans that we don't see in apes.
Rick, another question?
What impact, if any, do you think that GLP-1s will have on treating Alzheimer's in the future? I mean, given the correlation with the losing muscle mass and treating diabetes and so forth.
Yeah, if I may answer to this question, this is GLP-1 is therapy for diabetes. So, which means that it will help to keep your glucose under control, and then less hyperglycemia induce damage, not only to other organs, but brain as well. So this is very important, yes.
So I have a question then.
Sure.
So we know it also, GLP-1 agonists are affecting the gut microbiome, right?
And not only that, it also affects appetite through the brain, yes.
Hi, I don't have a science background, so I was lost a lot of the time, but
Sorry.
you said 5% of Alzheimer's is like genetically dispositioned or whatever. So if you have that marker, like, 23andMe and all those things come out and say you have the marker, what does that really mean?
So it increases your risk. So it depends. So there are genetic mutations for the early onset and familial. Typically in those individuals, a lot of them are being tracked. And what we see is onset of symptoms much earlier. So for sporadic late onset, symptoms typically are occurring after the age of 65 years old. For early onset of familial, and familial is typically the earliest, it can be as early as 20s and 30s. But typically early onset is more like 40s and 50s. So it really varies. And sporadic late onset, the primary component is apolipoprotein E. So if you have one of the E4 alleles, or duplicate is really the biggest risk, somebody like Chris Hemsworth, who was found to have that, it doesn't mean that he is definitely going to develop Alzheimer's. It means that he is at a higher risk for developing it, and he is at a higher risk for developing it at an earlier age.
For example, what I was telling you that if you have diabetes and you have this ApoE4 allele, then you're increasing your chances 50%. So if you drink alcohol on top of it, alcohol abuse, more than threefold increase of risk.
Is there anything done with like marijuana or any kind of, have you done
With
any studies on
Alzheimer's
that?
disease?
Yeah.
It's a really good question. I'm not aware of any. I mean, so marijuana does bind to cannabinoid receptors that are all throughout the brain. And we do see cognitive changes with marijuana use, particularly long-term chronic use. So I don't think it can be completely ruled out, but I don't think we know the answer to that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Melissa Edler, Dr. Takar Kasimov. Thank you, and thank all of you for coming to this edition of Brains on Tap.
That was IdeaStream's Jeff St. Clair moderating a recent conversation in the Brains on Tap series at Sibling Revelry in Westlake. If you missed any part of today's show, you can listen to the Sound of Ideas podcast or watch the show on the IdeaStream Public Media YouTube page. You can also hear a rebroadcast tonight at 9 on 89.7 WKSU. If you'd like to get the last word in today's conversations, you can email us at soi@ideastream.org. You can also find us on Instagram. We are at The Sound of Ideas. You can leave us a comment or send us a message there. Yesterday's conversation looked at the East Palestine train derailment settlement and class action lawsuit settlements in general with Norfolk Southern Railway, which our guests from the area are not happy about. Scott wrote in, curious, how much money does Norfolk Southern make annually? How much do their executives get paid? Isn't this just another case reflecting wealth inequality in the country and how that inequality allows everyday citizens to suffer and that wealth continues to get protected? Thank you for sharing the question with us. We appreciate it. Now, tomorrow on The Sound of Ideas, we're talking movies. The Academy Awards are this weekend, and we'll break down what you need to know about some of the nominated films as local cinephiles try to predict which gems will take home some hardware on Sunday. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you very much for keeping the conversation going. We'll see you back here tomorrow on The Sound of Ideas.